Good morning and welcome to this EPC policy briefing. I hope everybody is well and had a really great weekend. First of all, I apologise for the delay in starting, but we've had a bit of trouble with connecting with our friends in Australia. But I'm happy to say that Ambassador Noble has been able to join us now. The topic of today's event is how has terrorism threat changed 20 years after 9/11? A view from Australia. I would like to first of all thank the mission of Australia to the EU for their kind assistance in helping with the organisation of this event. I'm really delighted to be joined by Ambassador Roger Noble today. He is Australia's Ambassador for Counter-Terrorism, and he's currently coming us today from Canberra. He's been in this post since February 2021, so still quite new to it. But prior to this, the ambassador has had a very long and distinguished military career. He was head of military strategic commitments at the Australian Defence Force quarters. And before that, Ambassador Noble was also Deputy Chief of Joint Operations and Deployments in Iraq and Deputy Coalition Land Force Commander of the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan. So he has a very good knowledge and understanding of Afghanistan and much more. So I would like to give a very warm welcome to you, Mr. Ambassador. Today we are going to be assessing several different issues, including the impact of international counter-terrorism efforts, Australia's counter-terrorism and counter-violent extremism policies, prospects for regional security and prospects for cooperation between Australia and the EU on counter-terrorism, and many more other things. So to the audience, I have to give you the usual message. If you want to put a question, please either click on the hand icon and we can give you the floor, which is always very nice to hear other people's voices, or alternatively, you can write your question in the comment or Q&A box. And we hope you'll have lots of questions. So I want now to hand over to Ambassador Noble. I think he is with us there now on the screen. But before we get to the actual topic of international counter-terrorism, I would like to actually come with a couple of more general questions, if you don't mind. Obviously, there's been a lot in the news about the COVID pandemic in Australia. So I'd like to ask you, what is the situation now? Is it improving? Are you moving towards sort of a brighter period?
Yeah, hi everybody. Sorry I'm late. It's the COVID world, so you live in virtual hope that the technology works, but we've got it working now. So to the COVID situation in Australia. So our story is important. I think what I've learned from COVID is every country seems to need to learn itself what to do, but we initially actually were pretty successful in keeping it out of Australia. So we've had very low case rates, even this year, by comparison to Europe or other parts of the world. But earlier this year, the Delta strain got into Australia, and it would appear that because it's so much more infectious, some of the traditional means that stopped version 1 were not as effective. But Australia's, I think, gone over the hump now. And we've had about 60,000 total cases. Population's 25 million. We've imposed a whole range of public health measures from pretty tight lockdowns. We closed the border. So coming in and out of Australia now is by permission effectively or by exemption. And we've gone on to, for the first half of this year, into a heavy duty vaccination program. So I heard today, and we started probably relatively later than some countries, probably Europe, although we do make the AstraZeneca vaccine here, but we've rapidly ramped up. So I think today the state of New South Wales, where Sydney is, where most of the COVID cases are at present, hit 70% vaccination rate today. So there's a national plan in place to essentially gradually reduce the amount of restrictions and open up borders internally in Australia, plus also to the rest of the world. And that kind of kicks in over the 70 to 80 fully vaccinated rate for Australians. And we're on track to that. Each state is quite different. It's a federation here. So each state's had a different experience and is at a different rate. But I would anticipate, looking today, that by the end of the year, we'll be at around 80% vaccination rate nationally, and there'll be reduced internal restrictions. And the Prime Minister is determined to open the border, and he has spoken on the weekend around December, but of course, nothing's fixed. So that's kind of where we're at. I don't have how many people we've lost, but it's in the order of, it's probably just over 1,000 now actually killed as a result or died as a result of COVID. Does that give you a bit of a snapshot?
Yeah, thank you very much. That really gave us a good snapshot, and it's good to see that, you know, you're coming out of it the other side. And because I know lots of people who are desperate to come and visit Australia again, including my own son.
Yeah, I'd like to get out.
So I'm going to move on to the second item that's been in the news recently as well, vis-a-vis Australia. And of course, this is, you know, the famous AUKUS agreement, which has been dominating, you know, news headlines for the last couple of weeks. And it would be great if you could sort of just tell us why this agreement is so important for Australia's security and defence.
Yeah, I think it's probably the most important agreement for Australia in a very long time. And it's basically, to use the Prime Minister's words, it's a fundamental national interest. And it's about our interest in the region and having a free and open Pacific, and making sure that Australia can protect that aspiration and participate with its friends to do it. It's a defence and security pact, and it's primarily around sharing of technology and information. And for those of you not so familiar with Australia, you know, this is the 70th year of our alliance with the United States. So in a sense, it's an extension of that. And we only have two allies. One ally is the United States and the other one is New Zealand. And then it's an extension to the British, the UK, which obviously we have a long cultural history with and a very tight intelligence relationship with. So it's old friends sharing primarily technology and information with each other to a deeper level, which then allows a country like Australia to do something like build nuclear submarines, because we don't have a nuclear industry, nor do we have the technology to do that. So for an Australian, it's about the Pacific, our region, stability and friends, and it's not exclusive of other friends. So in the process, everyone's tracking the French submarine deal. And, you know, France is very important to Australia, and that hasn't changed at all. And France is a very important country in the Indo-Pacific. So it's got a heavy presence here, citizens, and it's been very influential and important. So if anyone's doubting Australia's commitment to France, they should not do so, albeit the impact of the submarine cancellation deal, which the Prime Minister, you know, he said it was a national interest decision, no less our friends in our minds. So that's where it's at. And it builds on the existing alliance with the United States and New Zealand, plus all our multilateral and regional groupings. We are not, if you're not European, you're used to being in a tight bloc and being in alliances like NATO. Australia's different. It's got a whole pile of multilateral arrangements, very few alliances. So, and it's kind of not been in a bloc like the EU, and there is no NATO out here in the Indo-Pacific. And then the last thing I'd add is you would have seen the Quad leaders meeting this week. That's another grouping of like-minded nations with similar objectives that Australia is part of. So that's the explanation from right down here.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Now I'd just like to move on to the topic of the discussion and come back to international efforts to counter terrorism. I mean, how would you assess the success of the efforts over the last 20 years? I mean, what's been achieved? I mean, what's been the main achievements? I mean, you yourself have been involved in the international mission against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. So you're well placed to answer this, I think.
Yeah, I'll give you the Australian view. The first thing you should say is there's been successes and failures at all different levels in different places. And there's been a hell of a lot of learning to come out of it. So what I thought, I'd answer the question by telling you the three big things we think we've learned, looking back 20 years to 9/11, but making the point that terrorism long predates 9/11. And even in Australia, where you might think terrorism is not a big problem, it is a problem. And it has gone back right through our history, actually. So I think the first lesson we've learned in the last 20 years post 9/11 is unity of effort works, partnerships matter, and teamwork is key. And that might sound, oh yeah, obvious. Actually, no, in counter-terrorism, because transnational global terrorist threats require unity of effort, partnership, and teamwork across the broadest set of stakeholders. So for us, that means multilateral, regional, bilateral, national, right down to the local level, and trying to bind as many key stakeholders across many enterprises in to make the counter-terrorist effort work. So it's not, for Australia, not just a law enforcement or a military activity, which is what I was principally involved in, but a whole of society, whole of nation effort, where civil society is a key participant. And in fact, we're pretty strong supporters of the UN Global CT strategy and the core ideas that are in it. So we think that's the number one lesson. And that lesson needs to be taken forward for the next 20 years. So the next lesson we've learned is you need to have an integrated, comprehensive approach. So once you've got the team established, you've got to deal with the threat comprehensively across all its, the way it operates and the way counter the narrative right through to its actions. So central to this is a kind of, for us, a national through to local approach. So one of the things we did in the last 10 years, we'd established joint counter-terrorism teams, which every state in the country has an integrated federal, state and local team of agencies, intelligence agencies, law enforcement agencies, but connected through to the social services capacity of each of our states to have an integrated response to violent extremism and terrorist acts. And then I think it's been really critical in our region, the integrated approach. So for Australia, you might, I don't know whether you remember the Bali bombing, the first one of October 2002, 88 Australians were killed in that attack. That's the most number of Australians killed, and that wasn't in Australia. So it was in our near neighbour of Indonesia. And so since that time, we've developed that integrated approach with our closest neighbours. So actually for counter-terrorism, countries like Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, the ASEAN member states are super important to Australia. And we now have a very, very close and tight kind of practical day-to-day relationship with those countries, and our agencies do as well, whether they be foreign affairs, military, law enforcement, intelligence, and then a whole pile of civil society links. So that integrated approach has spread across our region, which is our main effort. And then we also try and spread that further afield where we can to the limits of our capacity. And then we think, you know, this is probably the key lesson, because if you look ahead, there's plenty of challenges the world faces. There's COVID-19, just for a start, but there's climate change, there's traditional security issues, and all nations have a finite capacity to deal with everything. So our deduction is we've got to take this teamwork approach and the integration ahead the next 20 years. And it's more important than it's ever been to cooperate. So I just went on a trip through Europe. It's the only trip I've done this year. And I got to experience the non-stop PCR tests as I crossed borders. But I found it was really interesting that every nation in Europe practically, we share the same problems. We have the same challenges. They're just different in scope, scale, and context, depending on the particular circumstance of each country. But I went to the EU, and they were the best briefings I got were from the EU, and I was the first visitor in 18 months face to face. And we talked through the full range of issues that will confront us in the next 10 years. And my sense was we need to cooperate, and we want to cooperate on the same things by and large. And the last lesson was another kind of obvious one, but worth saying: sharing information and lessons saves lives and protects us all. So the biggest protection we've had is developing the capacity to share information on threats and how they operate and violent extremism and how to counter it. And we've done that in an interagency across internal Australian boundaries, a lot better than we did it before 2001. And we've done it internationally in a whole pile of contexts. So, I mean, the biggest, when you get to the military end of the spectrum for the global coalition to defeat Daesh, 83 nations working together, sharing against one particular threat set is just one example of that. But we've done it all around our region, and we've done it in every lane of activity that counters terrorism: policing, military, legal, diplomatic, expert issues, countering violent extremism, etc. So they're the three big lessons: unity of effort, partnership and teamwork. Lesson 2, integrated comprehensive approach works best. And 3, sharing the lessons that protect us all. So there are our lessons. And then I don't know if you stop or do we think, so what do the next 10 years hold? I'll tell you that. So the 3 big observations were, it's so obvious, but it's very important. The threat's persistent and dynamic. So you don't win against terrorism. It's a tactic and a method, but you've got to confront terrorists who, unfortunately, seem to be a recurring feature of the landscape, but they change and modify as time goes forward. So for us, the last 20 years, like a lot of European countries, the problem's been Islamist violent extremism. It still is our number one threat. But in the last few years, we've had a rise of ideologically motivated violent extremism, extreme right-wing, right supremacists. And you'd all be very aware of the attack in Christchurch was actually carried out by an young Australian man from rural Australia. So new threats, the old ones change and adapt, and then new ones appear and you've got to deal with them. So our deduction is it's persistent. You've got to confront it nonstop and be ready to do that with great commitment and vigilance. And it's dynamic. Don't expect it to stay the same. So the ideologies shift and change, the methods shift and change, and their objectives shift and change. So you've got to be ready for that. Observation 2, this is a really obvious one. The world changes. So I'd say to this audience, actually the rate of change is exponential. It's kind of proven scientifically. But also that means you've got to adapt quickly. So for us, online extremism is the big thing for the next 10 years. Both the proliferation of online violent extremism and the internet and information through to the digital world. So encryption, use of different platforms, modern digital financing methods. And I just read a really good paper from Germany, Business of Hate, I think it was called, about different platforms being used by extreme right-wing terrorists in the digital space. So we think that's the next big collaboration internationally, because cyberspace knows no borders. It's a bit like financing after 2001. What are the norms and methods for controlling on the online space, but at the same time protecting all of the freedoms and that we want from a free and open internet? And then I can tell you, from having asked every country I meet, haven't met 2 countries with exactly the same view on how to deal with the online space yet. So that's an area of collaboration and discussion that probably should lead for us. And then the third lesson, or third observation going forward for us is we got to deal with the root causes of terrorism. I keep going back to Iraq. I have been 3 times. Underneath the various iterations of Al-Qaeda, Daesh, often it's the same people or same ideas meshed with new groups in new ways. So I'm not picking on Iraq. It's wherever there's violent extremism, there are root causes. I love Iraq, actually. I really do. What are the root causes? Can you help address them? Can you do it through whatever means available to try and reduce the appeal and influence of violent extremism? Now that's a tough job. And that again is a team effort. And it's where I think the international community can really collaborate well. What is best practice for effective countering or preventing of violent extremism? What works? How do you measure it? How do you target it? And how do you share that best practice across a wide community of interested stakeholders? So I might stop there and see where you want to go next.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Noble. This was very clear insights into very many different topics related to CT and CV here. So you clearly know this dossier, very well already. But I would just like to return to the topic of Daesh in the Middle East. I mean, we know that they were militarily defeated. But I mean, how do you view this terrorist group
I think
today? I mean, first of all, I mean, on the ground in the region, but also, I mean, it's one thing to say they've been defeated militarily, but I mean, their ideology is still very much alive. And I mean, what do you think are the the good practices for actually pushing against this ideology, and what's been adopted in Australia to have a sort of counter narrative to what ISIS and other terrorist groups are spewing?
So I think the first thing is it remains a threat, the ideology, and it has appeal. And it's like back to that observation one, the threat's persistent, but it's dynamic. So it's shifting and changing. So yeah, there was pretty significant success against the notion of the caliphate in Iraq and Syria. I saw it myself. They were effectively defeated in the field. But, it's pretty hard to defeat an ideology. I saw a bunch of young Australian men in the bush doing the Nazi salute in a photo about 2 weeks ago. And Hitler's been dead a long time, but somehow that ideology, they probably don't even know who he is properly, but ideas stay and change and morph. So you've got to have a counter narrative, you've got to be relentless against it. And then I think we've learned use all available tools to try and counter this kind of idea and narrative. And inside Australia and across, I think Southeast Asia has been very successful, but inside Australia as well, really focused on what we call social cohesion and using the whole of society and all of the capacity that a society has to identify violent extremism and then counter it, both from communities, families, women and children, using all the tools we have, not just policemen and soldiers to fight. I think looking at Daesh going ahead, we are worried about ungoverned spaces is the term. So another one is permissive spaces. So the fallout from Afghanistan, we saw Daesh there attack the airport. How do we monitor, track and respond if we have to organisations like Daesh, and it's not just them, who may operate in areas where we can't see and get to as easily as other places, parts of Africa, in our own region. We've seen in the Philippines, southern Philippines, 2017 at Marawi, we saw a big spike in their influence. So again, it's a relentless look at those parts of the world which are hard to get to. And again, it's in those parts of the world where the international effort's the most important, because Australia's capacity in Afghanistan and Africa is pretty low, right? But we'll certainly participate with our international partners to do what we can. And then we'll do as much as we can in our own region with our really good partners like the Philippines and Indonesia. So relentless threat, an ideology that you probably can't kill, but one that needs a kind of whole of society, full court press constantly to counter the narrative and reduce its appeal.
And do you see that terrorist groups have used the pandemic to further spread their ideology? I mean, was it advantageous for them? I mean, obviously in developed countries, but I mean more so in, let's say, the countries of North Africa and elsewhere that have suffered significantly and now have big social and economic challenges that these sort of groups are able to channel into, again, with their ideology.
Yeah, I think everybody's worried about the impact of COVID on violent extremism. And I have spoken to all of our regional neighbours in the Southeast Asia, and it's had a mixed effect on terrorists and violent extremists, but it's had it's shut down travel, and it's shut down resource movement, but it's increased exposure to online violent extremist material. And in some ways, the thing I learned in Europe, actually, when I traveled there, and the Germans were spectacularly informed, was in the 21st century, you get a merging of ideas, and you mentioned ideas and ideologies in a way online that maybe we haven't seen before. So you can find common ground between right-wing extremists in the United States and the Taliban, or you can find conspiracy theorists linked through to Islamist violent extremists, and you can find Al-Qaeda and Daesh with common ground. So it's a frightening mix online that's enabling connections that we probably haven't seen before, which we've got to guard against, thinking that the world will stay the same as it was.
Yeah, the world never stays the same though, does it?
No, unfortunately.
I have a question now, actually related to foreign fighters, because I mean there was Australians that went to fight again with Daesh.
Yeah.
How has Australia dealt with returning fighters?
Yeah, so we've our current, at the moment we think in the order of 65 foreign terrorist fighters, families and children still in Syria. That's about the number that we assess. It's an estimate because we're not 100% sure who's alive and where everybody is. We've previously, when they've come back to Australia, which haven't been many recently, so mainly before 2016, we try to manage their return in an orderly way so that they are received, and if appropriate, they're met by the police and move into the legal law enforcement system. For other returnees, we've used focused on reintegration when they've gone into society. In 2019, we brought back all of our known unaccompanied minors, which is bureaucratic speak for orphans, children, out of the camps in northeastern Syria. I think we were one of the first countries to do that. And then we did a full kind of whole of society package around those kids so that when they got back, they were put into families, communities, well-received education. And I'm proud to say I couldn't tell you where they are or who they are because that's all unknown to everybody. So that initial feedback from them, those kids, was it was very successful, better than we didn't have any of the downside that we expected. But we also learned that it's very case specific, so it depends on the individual. So the government's approach to the remaining foreign fighters that are in northeast Syria is to take a case-by-case approach to their return. And that we're not putting people in harm's way to repatriate them. But it remains a constant issue that's monitored. And we remain particularly worried about the humanitarian situation in the camps, which in our assessment is not good, depending on which one. I think Al Hol camp is probably the worst. We note the security influence of Daesh in the camps. And so we watch that as best we can with the resources that we have to see where it's headed. So it's a very difficult problem. I've spoken to lots of countries, many countries like Australia, balancing the range of risks, trying to see where it's headed. Unlike Australia, a lot of countries have a much bigger problem with many more fighters than we do, but it's the same set. So I'd say to this audience, what do we need as an international community is, I think, really the world's best practice in risk assessment. How do governments make assessments around people and the threat they might pose, whether they be kids, foreign fighters or wives or spouses or family members? And then what's the best practice in de-radicalisation? And there's a debate about whether you can do it at all. And I think the truth is sometimes you can't and sometimes you can. But what works? How do you deal with it? What ideas and I was talking to the Moroccans who were I asked the Moroccans this question and their answer was, the most important thing we found is mothers of young men. They're the most influential group. And they briefed me on their program of actually educating mothers about the Quran and what it says about women, etc., in order that they could run we would call it maybe a counter narrative with their son, but probably more just an informed discussion about their own religion and beliefs. And they found that very effective as well. So I think sharing that, what works with what communities, and it's not just Islamist extremists, it's no different for any other form of violent extremism. We're wrestling now with how do you get through to the young male ideologically motivated violent extremism that we're seeing in Australia. So, which, for example, seems to be more rural than in the city. So sharing that best practice helps understand how you can manage the risks the security risks you face when you return foreign fighters or families, etc. So that's kind of where we're at.
Thank you. I agree. I agree with you. It's very difficult to understand whether somebody's actually de-radicalized because only they themselves can actually know that inside their heads. And as we know from these tragic incidents that have happened in the UK and Austria, there's this increasing phenomena of disguised compliance, where somebody makes a very good sale of themselves being de-radicalized, but then goes out to carry out a terrorist attack. That should be, you know, it's an issue that deserves far more research. But I think the thing about Moroccan mothers it sounds like a very interesting case study, actually, because, you know, the women do have a good influence over their sons, actually, or at least sometimes they do, sometimes more than the fathers. But I would just like to, I would like to ask you one more question. Then I want to give the floor actually to my colleague who has a question, and it's about the role of community policing in Australia. I mean, how important is this in terms of, you know, rooting out potential victims of extremism before they go too far down that road? Because I know it's something in Europe, at least in Belgium as well, that's been quite successful.
I think that's a central pillar of our national approach, and it's done at the very lowest level with policemen on the street, but not just policemen, the networks in the society to identify the threat or potential and to do what you can to counter it and divert it or to fix it. So we've got actually a program. I'll just give you the correct name of it again. It's a social cohesion. We call it social cohesion. Like most countries, when you speak to them, you've got to balance the role of the government and official narratives versus influence with potential people who are, you know, on the path towards violent extremism. And the most powerful speakers to them are often nothing to do with the government. So we kind of, at the federal level, there's a oversight resourcing arrangement and a kind of narrative, but about most of the actual interaction with people is right down the grassroots, local level, through local people, where possible, communities, partners, and then all of the things that are particularly unglamorous and no one makes a movie about, but are extremely important. So the role of the education department, for example, and I received a brief from New South Wales a week ago about how they do targeted education and training around troubled children generally in society. And then they can also target that towards children that are perceived to be on a path towards violent extremism. So we kind of have a strategic communications effort as well, and we're always working on that. So how do you get a message that cuts through using all of the available online means that I was talking about, that the terrorists can use to get to the right people. So we've got a couple in the works now. And the interesting thing for me is who's the right messenger? How do you convey a message? And ours are very Australian. So, getting the right kind of person to talk to the right kind of person is absolutely critical. And then the police here, community policing approach is absolutely central to it. So it's a partnership, not an adversarial approach. And you only use force of the law as an absolute last resort. If you can use all of your connections with the community and all parts of it, all the better. I think what we're learning is we have to adapt it. So it's not static. So, Al-Qaeda is not Daesh, the ideologies shift. And then at the moment, one of the things we're doing is, hey, all the things we've learned for Islamist, violent extremists, how much of that applies across to, say, white supremacists or ethno-nationalist, ideologically motivated violent extremism? So we're in the process of trying to do that learning. And I think talking to this European audience, that's where you can really help us, I think. Unfortunately, you have some probably more experience of it than we do. We've said the same to the Americans, and helping us share to learn, how do you do the social cohesion, grassroots, counter extreme right wing would be of great benefit to us, because we're on a pretty steep learning curve. I think that's pretty much it. I should say prisons and corrective services have become really important to us. How do you operate with Europe? We have a lot of convicted terrorists in jail. They're going to be released in the next 5 years, probably up to about 50. And then the other key piece is, back to the Moroccans, is families, women, gender, children and youth. So all of those parts of the puzzle, as you're part of your protecting the society and reducing the appeal of violent extremism, are increasingly important to us.
No, I agree with you, and I also agree that the war against violent extremism will be won at a local level. This is absolutely for sure, for all of the reasons that you've just given, and with everybody in that local areas working together hand in hand. This will be the crucial thing in defeating it, not the guy sitting in the military or the high-ranking police. So I just want to give the floor to my colleague Jana, if she's there for a moment. Jana? No? I think she may be having a connection as well. Okay, I'm going to ask a question I know she wanted to ask, and I know we've more or less run out of time, but it was actually about your cooperation with the EU that you touched on. But could you elaborate what are the key elements of this? What are the main areas where you do this counter-terrorism cooperation, and where do you think cooperation could be enhanced?
I think so. This is an Australian talking about the EU. So our view of the EU is it's a very important grouping because of the member states of the EU, but also because it's not a nation state itself. So it is extremely influential in a variety of forums that we participate in, whether it be the United Nations, but also we participate in a like-minded grouping, which is, no one can ever define like-minded, but the EU's in it as an entity. So it gives us a kind of very powerful collective like-minded view, not always the same as Australia's view, but it's both a sounding board and a reinforcing entity for Australia. And because you believe fundamentally the same things we do about counter-terrorism and norms, importance of human rights, primacy of the rule of law, whole of society approach. They are very kind of core common beliefs that we have with you. and you're extremely influential with other actors that are important to us. So you might not, you probably know, but your influence in our part of the world is significant, and you'll listen to the EU's listened to because it's not a nation state, it's a collective. So I've said to them, where you share best practice and you raise a collective issue, you can have a lot of power and influence in our part of the world with all of the partners and with us as well. The one really big space that I talked to them about most was actually online extremism. And it's really not about counter-terrorism or even violent extremism online. It's about how does the internet work and the governance approach in order to control and violent online extremist material. But it could apply to child exploitation or organised crime. So that big question, which is probably for the world the next 10 years, how does the internet work? What are the governance arrangements? How do we establish that set of norms around violent online extremist material so that we can effectively control it, but at the same time, not sacrifice other critical things to us that are important to the EU and Australia? And I think there are differing worldviews on how to do that. Different nations have different views, going from leave it to the private sector right through to we'll do it all ourselves from government. And EU and Australia are relatively close on that spectrum. So I think that space, because that's a real global international norms issue. No one nation will be able to control the internet. No one nation will set the rules, but collective blocks can help shape how we'll get to wherever we get to, and without throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So last thing is those ungoverned spaces. So I'd just say question mark, how are we going to deal with those places, that where influence and capacity and a whole pile of sovereignty issues might mean some methods that have been employed elsewhere are not available. So what about Africa? And Europe's interests in Africa are significant. What about Afghanistan? What about Syria? Even in our part of the world, although I do commend the work of all our neighbours, it's always a persistent problem. Last thing I'd say to you is I wouldn't use the metaphor of a war anymore because of the persistent nature of the threat. Because when you say war and winning, it sets the expectation that it's going to end. And I think the grim reality is it isn't going to end. It's going to change and be suppressed and controlled. And what we're really doing is, it's not a military thing. We're protecting our people and protecting our interests, and we're going to do it forever. So just put that out there, because, I grew up on the global war and terror battlefield myself. But I think the truth is it's more of a struggle against an enduring disease as opposed to a war with an end and a finite objective that we can all say it's over now. I'll just throw that in.
Thank you. No, I like that. We're pushing back against a very dangerous disease, and it's proving actually extremely difficult. But, we need to maintain the efforts to do that. And because sometimes, when this, at least in Europe, when there hasn't been a terrorist attack for a while, the issue sort of disappears off the radar and we get very, very complacent. And this is a serious mistake, because you never know what's going on behind in your neighbour's house, in a bedroom or in the attic or something like this. We need to remain on high alert, particularly in these times after the pandemic and whatnot. One never knows. So there's still plenty of work to be done, and important cooperation between our partners in sharing, good practices, best practices, or even worst practices, because we can certainly all learn from each other. Rather than doing things in a bubble. And I think we've learned not to do that anymore. So hopefully it will continue. I would like to thank you very much, Ambassador Noble, for joining us this morning, or in your case, in the evening in Canberra, for sharing your views on this very important topic, both in the fighting international terrorism, but also probably the more important issue, preventing radical extremism in the first place. You know, prevention is the key to everything. So really thank you for sharing your views, for joining us. It was a great pleasure. I hope that we will have, you know, further opportunities in the future to have you speak again and to continue our cooperation with our friends in Australia. It's always a pleasure. So I'd like to wish you a great evening. I hope you're going to be doing something nice, and all of the best of luck for your work ahead, actually. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. I'm honoured to be invited to speak to you. I mean, you should be no doubt up there. Australia's a good friend of Europe and all the countries, and our connections are deep and long, and our common interests are high, particularly in violent extremism and countering it. So you're all welcome here as soon as the borders open, and I hope to see you when I can get back up there. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much.